Hello everyone. This is the third part of the story, Abe the Wizard. Chapter 9, The Ranks Just Keep Ascending. It was until dawn when Nora had left Abel's room. After his mother was gone, Abel sat quietly on a chair and contemplated his life over the last 2 years. Despite his appearance, Abel was a 40-year-old man on the inside. It wasn't like he didn't know what the Knight of Bennett was thinking. He agreed very much with the decision that was made for him. If he wasn't so gifted at such an early age, everything could have been normal for him. Instead of leaving to an unknown place at an age as early as 12, he could have left the family when he reached adulthood. Abel saw what was coming for him, and he was ready to take it. He took out his Horadric Cube, revealed a bottle of the golden chi condensing pill, and opened its cap. He wanted to save it for later, but the challenge ahead would not let him delay. Not long ago, the Bennett Castle was a safeguard that protected Abel's safety. Without it, he had learned to protect himself with whatever he could lay his hands on. As the amber-colored liquid slid inside his throat, Abel could feel his inside filled with a vigorous essence. The chi kept on channeling through his muscles, but unlike most regular potions, it did not take away any of the food that he had eaten before. It quickly materialized and was turned into his third meridian. It was doing this at a very steady pace, too. Unlike most times, when he had tried to do it on his own, Abel didn't have to worry if the process was going to fail. Abel practiced his breathing techniques every night, but he was never so successful as he was now. On a regular night, he could do 20 sets at most. He would have to take breaks between each one of them. Things were very different tonight. He was going very strong. Even the curtains were moving at the rhythm of his breathing. It took about half an hour for the potion to wear off. By this time, there were 3 stabilized meridians inside Abel's body and some excess chi which could have filled in half more. Abel was surprised about this, of course. As it turned, the master's potion was much more powerful than what Yvette had told him. Were the rumors wrong, then? Well, not exactly. Technically speaking, a master's potion was still far from being a perfect potion. As skilled as a potion master might be, human craftsmanship still had its limitations. The Horadric Cube was free from such a flaw, though. Since Abel was crafting his chi condensing potion mechanically, every little detail, proportions and such, were all taken into consideration and was in respect to the power of the rule. This was, to put it simply, was a force that belonged to the gods. As a divine item, the Horadric could utilize a fraction of this power to transform whatever item that it contained. This was the reason why the master's potion Abel created was much more potent than a regular one. It was like asking a god to help with a novice knight's training, and what kind of god would be so bored to do that? It was hard to resist the temptation once it started to kick in. After leveling himself up in just half an hour, Abel decided to take in another bottle of his master's potion. And there it was again. In virtually no time whatsoever, chi quickly emerged and became Abel's 4th meridian. The effect of the potion quickly vanished after it had done its job. Abel quickly stood up from the ground. He noticed that his entire body was covered in dark, stinky stains. After enhancing his bodily function in such a short period of time, all the dirty substances inside of him were quickly excreted out. Abel quickly ran to the bathroom to clean himself up. Having used 3 bucketfuls of water, he tried as hard as he could to scrub away the stench off him. After he was done, he opened up his room's window and tried to let the wind take the smell away. Abel was half naked while he was doing this. He had grown 10 centimeters over the past 6 months, putting him at 160 centimeters in height. He was just a kid, but the muscles on him were already pronounced. As buff as he was, Abel was still very humble. He had great respect for the fighters in this world. Whether it was a mercenary or a knight, anyone with a weapon could pull off a very impressive fight. That being said, though, most of them wouldn't know how to fight properly with their own bodies. If 2 men were to fight against each other with nothing but their bare fists, they would simply throw straight punches at each other and watch who went down first. As a former gym trainer, Abel was acquainted with the use of several types of martial arts. He knew boxing, MMA, Muay Thai, and Tai Chi. He wasn't an expert, so to speak, but the knowledge he possessed has made him a very formidable opponent in any type of hand-to-hand combat. If it was hand-to-hand combat, Abel could easily defeat Zack, who was, obviously, much taller and stronger than him. Strength wasn't everything, so they said. With the power of sports science on his side, everyone in this world seemed clumsy to Abel when they fought with nothing but their bare fists. And very rightly so. In this world, there was hardly any need to develop any hand-to-hand combat system. The humans' biggest foes were the orcs. Brawling with those monsters head-on was just suicide. What about against other humans, then? Well, royals solved their disagreements with sword duels. Fighting with no weapon was considered foul and in some way, very disrespectful to one's opponent. As Abel practiced a few reps of his standard punches, he could felt a significant increase in his power and speed. It was good and all, but such an improvement was kind of hard to get used to. Just when he was grabbing his wooden cup for a sip of water, his fingers snapped it into shreds. Too much progress could have their downturns, so it seemed. But that was fine. Abel was 12 years old now, with only 1 month left before his 13th birthday. By that time, he would have already made the same achievement as Zack did when he was 18. Abel readied himself for his Tai Chi practice. While he was repeating the moves that were taught to him, he tried to remember what his instructors used to say. From what he could remember, the instructor said that Tai Chi was the best martial art for holding back one's brute force. Tai Chi was about reserving one's power, moving in an unending sequence of movements, being able to both escalate and de-escalate at the same time and having a natural rhythm while fulfilling all these conditions. It was about harmonizing one's entire being into a collected whole, which was much easier said than done. Abel had to calm himself down after taking that second potion. After stabilizing himself from a state of excitement, he began to act out all 74 postures of his Tai Chi sequence. It was the beginning posture, the Vajra pounds mortar, grasp and tuck clothes, all the way until the 74th posture. The sun was very much up high after he was finally done. As it turned out, Tai Chi didn't make you have a weaker punch. It just made you appear weaker than you were. With his Tai Chi techniques activated, Abel noticed that he was much weaker than he truly was when he was looking at himself in the mirror. If he was to tone down his Tai Chi, he was a rank 4 novice knight. But if he was to activate it, he could appear in whatever rank which he so desired. He could not pretend to be at a level that was higher than what he was actually at. This was very convenient. It was hard to make up a reason to explain why he had ranked up for 2 in just a single night, but having a camouflage meant that there was no need in doing so. Abel could just keep putting himself at rank 2 while he was packing up his luggage. Chapter 10, Departure. It was a cold morning at the start of December. As things were starting to get busy for the Bennett castle, the servants had to start cleaning the stables right after they woke up. The stablemen fed beans to the 2 chariot horses. The cleaners brushed all the swords, armors, and boots inside the house. There was even a new rein for the Knight of Bennett's steed. While Abel and his servants came out with the luggage, 6 lancers were waiting for him in front of the castle gate. While not necessarily grand in any way, they were standing very neatly around a line of chariots. It was a small farewell parade designated for the young master's leave. These men were all wearing blue leather armor. They had boots as high as their knees and wore blue woolen hats on top of their heads. Apart from their 3-meter-long lances, everything they had on them was sewn inside the Bennett castle. While the wool might not be protective against arrows, they did make it easier to pull one out of a soldier's wound. There weren't many decorations in the parade. Apart from the 2 soldiers hanging up the thorn shield flag on the tip of their lances, there wasn't anything that stood out in particular. Since blue was the base color of the Bennett family's coat of arms, every fabric in this parade, costumes and curtains and so on, all had to have the same uniform tone. Just while Abel was carrying the box onto his chariots, the Knight of Bennett rode his battle steed outside of the castle gate. Behind him was Abel's mother, Nora, who had eyes full of tears as Zack held her. The Knight of Bennett was looking especially solemn. Under the bright shine of the sun, every plate of his silver-white armor was glowing in shivering light. He wasn't wearing his helmet, for some reason. His helmet and weapons were all hanging on one side of his saddle. His long hair was tied up in a simple tail, which kept moving around as the cold wind went by. Nora didn't say anything to Abel. She just kept looking at Abel, almost as if she had already told him everything last night. It was like she was looking at the most precious treasure in the world. One way or another, Zack always knew that Abel was going to leave the castle. It was a tradition that no one could go against, which was why he was always so loving towards his only brother. He didn't expect Abel to leave so early, though. "This is your home, Abel. Come back when you have the time to." Zack came to hug his little brother. Technically speaking, Abel was just as strong as him, but the grasp was so tight that it felt more overwhelming than intended. Abel was quite calm this whole day, but he felt like he was going to lose it at this moment. The morning sun didn't feel quite warm during winter. And, because of how loud the wind was howling, every flag in the parade was waving around like they were out of control. Abel didn't sit inside the chariot cabin. Instead, he was riding on top of a 3-year-old mare right in the middle of the parade. Because of how oversized his father's queer bouillie was, he was now wearing a leather armor covered in wool. He was carrying a light sword on his back. So light, in fact, that it felt almost useless for a rank 4 novice knight. Abel turned around for a final look at his mother and brother. He couldn't do it for too long, however. The moment he turned his head around, he felt like tears were immediately welling up his eyes. Since the headquarters couldn't be unguarded, not a lot of people joined the farewell parade. Apart from Abel and the Knight of Bennett, there were about 9 people in total who left the Bennett castle. As the second best fighter in the Bennett Knight's domain, Norman was left with the task of being the Bennett castle's temporary headmaster. Knights were the lowest amongst royalty. That being said, not just anyone could be qualified to serve them. Loyalty, reliability, competence in combat, and being of noble birth were all crucial features to being qualified as a knight's underlings. Take Norman, for example. He had been a brother of the Knight of Bennett ever since the war. He was only granted the status of a knight after he had his loyalty confirmed, and was taught the Bennett family's secret techniques at a much later time. It was a rewarding journey for him, to say the least. For the years of his devotion, he was promoted from a regular guard to being the honored underling of a noble knight. Many wandering knights were desperate for a master with his own territory. Once accepted, the head knight would be responsible for all their day-to-day expenses. This included weapons, armors, and even the housing of the underlings. With this much at stake, one had to be extra careful in choosing his most trusted underlings. The parade went on for a total of 6 hours. Apart from the half-hour break during lunchtime, the men didn't stop their feet at one single time. Thankfully, no one was bold enough to be a disturbance. Even the beasts could tell how dangerous the Knight of Bennett was. This was the furthest Abel had been from home. He could vaguely recall the 11 years of the real Abel's childhood, and it was truly his very first time to be this far away from home. Sadly, though, there wasn't much scenery to lay his eyes on. Apart from some evergreen plants lying on the side of the road, everything just looked kind of gloomy and dull around here. Thank the spirit that it wasn't snowing. As dusty as the soil road might be, it was a much more preferable choice than trekking on wet, mushy ground. From what Abel had heard from others, roads in the big cities were all paved in large, smooth stones. For some reason, it kept reminding him of the concrete roads he had remembered from planet Earth. How nice would it be if there were concrete roads in this world? Abel was about to extend on his imagination, but he also remembered his oath to not make any inventions. Like the irrigation system he had built for the Bennett Castle, creativity without protection would only bring disaster to him and those around him. As a grown man who had received modern education behind everybody's back, Abel could think faster than the real Abel could. He was also smarter than the version of himself on Earth. Whether it was fighting, etiquette, or anything culturally related, he could pretty much understand in a snap of a finger. It was almost as if he had received a buff when he arrived in this world. After a while, the roads were going from soil to Portuguese pavements. The Knight of Bennett wasn't surprised at it. If anything, he knew exactly why this was the case. "This is what makes the martial knight special," the Knight of Bennett said to Abel as he pointed to the ground below. "He's all about not losing face in front of others. If there was a mountain to mine around here, he would have used giant boulders to pave the roads here." While staring at his father's shiny armor, the newly sewn decorations on his horses, and the brand new gears of the 6 accompanying lancers, Abel really felt like saying, "Father, if you are just a little bit richer, I'm sure that martial knight would have nothing on you if it's about losing faces." Chapter 11, Adoption. The Hairy Knight's domain was 300 miles west of the Bennett Knight's domain. In between them was another domain of an honorary lord. If there wasn't a need to go around this region, there was no way that Abel's trip would have taken as long as 6 hours. Despite being a royal who was granted his own land, the Knight of Bennett was in the middle-high class, which was still a bit far from being an aristocrat. Besides, he wasn't quite good at socializing with the other nobles. He tried his best to keep a polite distance from the other upperclassmen. This made it quite difficult for him to request his own army to make a direct pass into another domain. The parade made its way to the Hairy Knight's domain at around 3 in the afternoon. From over a distance, Abel could see a very big castle in front. On either side of this castle, red banners were depicting a rearing unicorn. Needless to say, they were the family symbol of the Knight of Martial. From what Abel could see, his father clearly wasn't pleased to see this. The Bennett Castle had its own banner, but that was only 3 meters tall and 2 meters wide. It was something that the Knight of Bennett had inherited from his own father. While it was unfinished back then, he had to spend quite a bit of money to add the final touches to it. "It's a treasure for the next generation," he would always say. "He's doing this on purpose." The Knight of Bennett ground his teeth. "I've told him about the banners." Abel saw this, of course, and decided to slow down his horse for a bit. As upset as his father was, he didn't want to bring himself too close to any sort of trouble. At the front gate of the Hairy Castle, a middle-aged man was wearing a full set of golden armor. He was accompanied by 2 of his bodyguards who, for the sake of rubbing it in just a bit more, were also fully equipped with some very fine leather gears. The Knight of Martial had a carving of the god of sun on his left chest and the crest of the white unicorn on his right. For someone of his age, he was much sturdier than most would expect. He was very tall, too. There were quite some wrinkles on his face, but instead of making him look old, it somehow gave off this mature and refreshing aura about him. Martial. With a growl of a bloodthirsty tiger, the Knight of Bennett jumped down his horse and quickly walked towards the Knight of Martial. The ground below him trembled every time he had taken another step. "Seth!" The Knight of Martial responded with a roar that was just as loud and angry. With his golden hair flying in the air, he approached the Knight of Bennett with the menace of a fully maned lion. No one knew how to react to this. The two were meant to be best friends, but they looked like they were about to beat each other up. The two just kept on walking towards each other. They were so close to each other that their fists were perfectly in range for a knockdown punch. They didn't stop at that point either. Instead, when their chests were an inch apart, the two jumped at the same time and collided themselves right into each other. No fist. No kicks, either. Just 2 men pushing against each other with their armored chest. If Abel were to describe it, the noise that followed was almost to that of a car crash at full speed. What a strange but impressive exchange of raw strength. Both the Knight of Bennett and the Knight of Martial had to take several steps back. The Knight of Bennett cursed as he steadied his 2 legs. "You became an intermediate knight. Why the hell didn't you mention that in the letter?" "Well, the same could be said for you. The Knight of Martial replied as he caressed the bruise on his golden armor, "You didn't say you've become an intermediate knight." The Knight of Bennett, too, felt the urge to look at the dent on his own breastplate. After figuring out the cost that was needed for repair, he gave another shout towards the Knight of Martial. "You play dirty, don't you?" "Yeah, I did become one. If I didn't, I would be on the ground right now." "Dirty? Look who's talking." The Knight of Martial threw a dirty look at the Knight of Bennett. The Knight of the Bennett did the same, and the two just kept on staring at each other in silence. Just when everyone thought that there was going to be a fight, the two suddenly slapped each other's armor with their fist. Then they started laughing and hugging each other. Apparently, none of that etiquette nonsense was important at this moment. The two brothers were glad to see each other, and that was all that mattered. As someone who held a secret so great he couldn't tell anyone about it, Abel could only hope to have a friendship this close. The adoption ceremony was very formal. They even invited a priest from the temple of the goddess of harvest. As the ceremony was being held, Abel received a suit directly from the Knight of Martial. The suit was marked with the symbol of the unicorn coat of arms, which signified that Abel had been officially accepted into the family. The welcome banquet commenced after the adoption ceremony ended. If a lord had no heir under his name, his property would be claimed by the duchy once he had passed away. Such a change would be devastating for everyone who depended on their livelihood under the family's name. That being said, while it was rather tragic for Abel to leave his original home, it was also something truly worthy of celebration for the ones who took him in. The Knight of Bennett didn't participate in the welcome banquet. He wasn't interested in celebrating his son leaving. After the adoption ceremony was over, he hastily went home with his men. Out of understanding for what the Knight of Bennett was feeling, the Knight of Martial spent no effort in trying to make him stay. After the day was over, the Knight of Martial took Abel to a 2-story tall building on the left side of the hairy castle. "This will be your room from now on." The Knight of Martial opened the door and welcomed Abel in. "I hope you feel at home here." There was a lot of space on the first floor. The floor was made of some very hard rocks. At the edge were a table and some chairs for the guests, but that was about the only regular furniture here. The wall was stacked with a rack full of weapons. There were heavy swords, shields, bows, and lances. There was even a heavy axe that was only supposed to be wielded by the orcs. To be honest, this place felt more like a mini training room than a living room. As the base for a novice knight like Abel, pretty much all his daily needs could be fulfilled here. Credits could be given to the Knight of Martial. He had put in his thoughts when he decorated this whole building. The bedroom was up on the second floor. There was a very big, feathery bed that was almost too clean. Whether it was the oakwood wall or the wool carpet on the floor, everything had a glorious tone of white to it. As if this wasn't grandiose enough, the window was stretched from floor to ceiling. If you look outside, the view was much prettier than what you'd expect from regular homes. The Knight of Martial liked the color white. It must have something to do with the unicorn on his family's coat of arms. Even the big closet in Abel's room was made of white oak timber. "Don't you worry about what to wear here." The Knight of Martial opened up the closet, which had all kinds of new clothes inside. "These are all yours. It's going to be a while before your welcome party. Get some shower now. After you've got yourself some good rest, a maid will come to help you change into your formal attire." The Knight of Martial was a kind man. When he smiled at Abel, there was a certain warmth that felt both genuine and comforting. "Is there anything else that you want?" he asked once more before he went downstairs. "Don't hold back. This is your home from now on." "No, sir. This is already more than what I could ask," Abel said in a slightly anxious tone. As much as he appreciated the generosity of everyone in this castle, it was hard to get used to being this cared for by so many people at once. While alone in his new bedroom, Abel took a look outside the floor-to-ceiling window for some nighttime scenery. There were multiple dots of light flashing over the distance, most of which belonged to the guests who came over to the welcome banquet. All in all, the hairy castle was very close to Harvest City, which had a scale far greater than a small town like Fort Lee. This was Abel's new home from now on. He had just begun to acknowledge his new family, but fate decided to bring him out of his home, and here he was. A new family. A new life. Abel couldn't help but shake his head and let out a deep sigh. Once he became old and strong enough, he swore that he would do anything he could to help out his parents and brother. There were sounds of footsteps coming by the stairs. It was a maid, and she had just opened the bedroom door and came in. She was about 20 years old, and her face was round like a bun. "Your bathwater is ready now," she said humbly as if she didn't want to bother Abel too much. "Do you want to wash now?" With the maid leading his way, Abel came to a bathroom that was only meant for the hairy castle's masters. Strangely, everything was made of timber here, and that gave off this unique fragrance like what you would find in a sauna. The bathing tub was made of marbles, and there were dry flower petals sprinkled on top of the steaming hot water. Just when the maid was about to go in with Abel, she was ordered to stay where she was at. Abel might not look like it, but he was raised to follow the customs of the modern age. Having a female wash his body was not something he would feel comfortable with. Once he had washed, Abel had the maid help him get into his formal attire. Chapter 12, Welcome Banquet. While standing in front of the castle gate, the servants were busy welcoming the guests who had been invited by the Knight of Marshall. From lords of neighboring lands and royals living inside Harvest City, everyone who paid their visit tonight had some type of reputation to their name. This just showed how resourceful the Knight of Marshall really was. The banquet was to be held in the castle's main hall. There were hundreds of giant smokeless candles being lit across the building. For the supper tonight, there were some fine wine transported from Baikong City and some freshly cooked beasts that were just hunted from the forest. As the night approached, almost all the guests had made their way into the ballroom. No one would be late for an event like this, of course. While nighttime entertainment was plentiful on planet Earth, things get pretty dull in this world at night. The poor couldn't afford lanterns, so they would just sleep when the moon had made its appearance. The rich, on the other hand, had nothing else to do but to read books in their basements. The theater was an option if you lived in the city, but the shows were not displayed at every single night. It was very expensive to hold a banquet as big as this one. Most noblemen could only afford one or two in a year. Their wallets would be empty if they decided to go any further. Come to think of it, there was no banquet back at the Bennett Knight's domain. Abel didn't know how the Knight of Marshall managed his finances, but there was probably a lot the Knight of Bennett could learn from him. Since Abel was the star tonight, he and the Knight of Marshall had to wait on the second floor before making their entrance. They would only come out after the butler Lindsay had introduced them to the guests. "Thank you all for coming here," Lindsay called out in his fancy black suit. "Please, let's welcome the honorable owner of this estate, the Knight of Marshall. And let's welcome Abel, who is our new master of the Marshall family." The guests all started clapping as the Knight of Marshall and Abel came down the stairs. While Abel just kept on nodding his head to greet them, the Knight of Marshall seemed much more composed in this kind of situation. He held his head high, had a confident, wide grin on his face, and rose his cup for a celebratory toast with everyone. The Knight of Marshall was the only one that Abel recognized. Besides, as a young boy of 13, it wasn't like he was going to be invited to dance with any girls. The guests would say hello to him, but that was about it. The most he could do was to greet back at them and carry on. "Look at that lucky kid with his dark hair. Yeah. He's really lucky, isn't he? Hey, why is it him and not me? You. Come on, it should have been me. I look better than you on any given day." As Abel turned to the source of the noise, he could see a bunch of young men joking amongst themselves. They didn't seem to notice him, though, until he came a bit closer. Things started getting awkward real quick at that point. A young man in white suit bowed and apologized. "Sorry, we didn't notice that you're here." "No need for apologies," Abel greeted back with a bow of his own. "I was the one who interrupted your conversation." Abel was technically a middle-aged man. Upon his arrival at the hairy castle, he had already prepared himself for any gossip that could go behind his back. Besides, these boys were just having a chat. There was no big deal about that. From what it looked like, these few youngsters took a liking in Abel's cool demeanor. They started dragging him into their little group and started talking about gossip together. At one point, they discussed how a lord found himself a new lover. Another time, it was about someone who caught some kind of prey. The man in the white suit was Isaac, the oldest son of Baron Victor. He was the one who brought up Abel back then. Being adopted by an heirless knight was considered as extremely lucky, and Abel happened to be one who has won the jackpot. Baron Victor, who was one of the many barons living inside Harvest City. Overall, barons lived a comfortable life wherever they were, but most of them still had to work for their lavish expenses. To be a nobleman, one had to spend quite some gold for all sorts of things. This was why noblemen tended to engage in the trading business. While such practices were considered lowly to the eyes of the aristocrats, they had no other choices but to learn to live with it. They had no lands of their own. Even someone like the Knight of Bennett was considered better than them because, well, at least he owned his piece of land. No land, and no castle. This was why the barons could only live in the city. Life was convenient here, but nothing could be freer than living in your own castle. Besides, owning a piece of land was the same as having a secured source of income. It would mean securing the funding of your own troops and being able to grow your own crops. No wonder Isaac sounded so sour back then. As long as there was no ill intention behind it, Abel didn't mind being the target of jealousy. While sipping his wine, Abel listened to the conversation between these young men. He would occasionally say something as to not appear unsocial to them, but he also tried not to be too intrusive while doing so. Everything was seemingly well until he felt a menacing stare. Abel wasn't sure what was going on, so he just pretended to not notice it. His eyes were scanning across the crowd, though, and his hand still waggling onto that wineglass he was holding. It was a young man. He had an upright stature, a handsome-looking face, and blonde hair that was combed as neatly as it could get. His eyes were rather slanted, however, and that somehow made him look more feminine than he should be. Abel lightly tapped Isaac on his arm. "Who is that?" "Him." Daniel threw a quick glance at the boy, but quickly turned his head back in disgust. "Oh, his name is Daniel. If you ask me, he's as slimy as it gets." "Why would you say that?" Abel asked in curiosity. "Well, his father was a merchant, but his older sister got married to Lord Walker, and makes him half a nobleman. You'd think he'd be satisfied with that, but oh no. After hearing about how the Knight of Marshall didn't have an heir, he started begging his sister to help him get adopted. His sister couldn't do anything about it, of course, so she asked Lord Walker to talk directly with the Knight of Marshall. He did, and the Knight of Marshall turned him down right away. Isaac seemed keen to talk about this kind of stuff. You know what the other nobles say about this? It's been a real hot topic amongst themselves lately. Isaac paused for a bit more of his wine. He wanted to see some sort of reaction from Abel but was slightly let down by how calm this young boy was being. They've been saying that, good boy. Daniel doesn't know his place. Can you believe that? Not just him, everyone's been making fun of Lord Walker. He kind of deserved it, too, to be honest. What kind of knight would take in the son of a merchant? Even if the Knight of Marshall said yes, his whole family wouldn't agree to that. Thanks to how gossipy Isaac was getting, he pretty much told Abel everything he knew about Daniel. Because of him, Abel was starting to understand why Daniel had such a dislike for him from the very start. But still, Abel didn't like talking behind other people's backs. He thought it was boring, and to be fair, most of the information that was thrown around was nothing but rumors. After spending a few more minutes with these youngsters, he said goodbye to them and went to the toilet. Oddly enough, Daniel saw this and went to the toilet as well. Abel didn't go in the toilet. Instead, he went to a nearby window for some fresh air. His 12-year-old body was not quite used to having liquor yet. While the chilling night wind was blowing on his face, he reminded himself that he wasn't going to have any alcohol from here on. For crying out loud, he was a former bodybuilding trainer. He knew better than to engage in underage drinking. As the host of today's event, it would be rude to be absent for too long. But just as Abel was about to walk back to the hall, someone suddenly started charging towards him. Abel was fast enough to react to this, so he started activating his level 4 novice knight power. Whoever this fool was, he didn't make Abel flinch. If anything, after running into him, he was bounced back 3 meters from where he came from. His body flew in the air for a while, and his body started sliding for an extra 2 meters before he finally stopped. Realizing that there was a situation going, people started coming over for a look. "It's Daniel," a knight came and turned over the body of the attacker. A young woman in fluffy skirts starting running over. "Oh my! Dear Daniel, what happened to you?" "Abel. What just happened?" The Knight of Martial came and demanded an explanation. "I'm not sure either." Abel opened his arms to feign ignorance. "He started charging at me. Next thing I know, his whole body started flying away." The Knight of Martial didn't see it himself, but it wasn't hard for him to figure out what actually happened. Abel was a newcomer to this castle. He barely knew anyone, which meant that he had no motive to hurt anyone. And even if he was trying to show Daniel who's boss, it was unlikely for him to do it on the day of his welcome banquet. As for Daniel, the Knight of Martial knew who he was. After rejecting this young man's imprudent request, he remembered being mocked by his friends for turning him down so quickly. If it wasn't because of Lord Walker, he would very much like to teach this young man a lesson in proper etiquette. And here they were. The Knight of Martial didn't want to cause anything big, but what Daniel had done was unforgivable. At a banquet held by the Knight of Martial, he decided to assault the future heir of the Martial family. Abel was already a noble now, which made the crime twice as severe than it already was. While paying no attention to the crying young woman nearby, the Knight of Martial called out to Lord Walker, who was still standing back in the crowd. "Sir Walker. So what is the purpose of you bringing Daniel to my castle? Is this an attempt to ridicule the Harry family? Or are you trying to set up a duel with me on behalf of your family name?" Lord Walker had quite a displeased look on his face when he saw Daniel on the ground. Honestly, he would have never brought Daniel here if he knew how feral the boy would be. Daniel was begging him to let him have a look at the next heir of the Harry family. That was the only reason he was allowed to tag along. Chapter 13, Morning Call. Lord Walker gave a deep bow to the Knight of Martial. "I'm sorry for this, sir. Someone like him should have never been allowed to attend an event like this. Please, settle this in whatever ways that you see fit." Whilst acknowledging the apology with a nod, the Knight of Martial pointed his finger towards Daniel. "Guard. Send him to prison. I want him to be trialed in Beikong City by tomorrow." "No. You can't do this," the woman cried even louder, but she was quickly dragged away by Lord Walker. The two left the castle before the banquet had even ended. While watching from the side, the butler Lindsay rubbed his chin with his hand. He witnessed the confrontation from start to finish. There was a good chance that he had discovered something. The banquet went back to normal quite quickly after that. No one was going to pay too much attention to the sad bastard who offended a knight, especially when that bastard wasn't even a nobleman. Once the banquet was over, all the guests were led to the guest room. The butler Lindsay then came to the Knight of Martial, who was busy cleaning his armor. "What?" The Knight of Martial dropped his cherished armor on the ground. "Abel is a rank 4 novice knight. Are you sure about this?" "Yes, sir," the butler Lindsay asserted. "While I am only a rank 5 warrior, the energy Sir Abel released back then was, without a doubt, something that would only belong to a rank 4 novice knight." "Ha, the Knight of Martial laughed frantically as he started slapping the table with his hand. "Seth is going to be so pissed about this. If only he knew that his son was a genius." "Oh, but he doesn't know, does he?" Why else would he give Abel to me? From what I've heard, Lindsay lowered his voice for a reminder, the eldest son of the Bennett family is still a rank 4 novice knight, and he is 18 right now. Yes, despite being wrong about Abel's intentions, the Knight of Marshall felt moved by Abel's decision to hide away his real power. Abel is a good child. He didn't want to discourage his older brother, so he's been hiding his real potential this entire time. Send a letter to the old men at Bakong City. I want them to know about this, the Knight of Marshall commanded, then took a look at the armor he had just dropped. Another thing. I want a full set of the Blazing Sun armor. When I left the place years ago, what they gave me was fake. Now I've brought a super genius into the family. They ought to do more to reward me this time, no? Yes, master, the butler Lindsay replied. He didn't mind if his master sounded a little brash there. For the Knight of Marshall, his passion for the Blazing Sun armor was just as strong as his love for his deceased wife. The Blazing Sun armor was the standard military equipment of the Blazing Sun Empire, an ancient empire known for its spectacular army. Whenever the sun shone on a piece of the Blazing Sun armor, its surface would glow with a red identical to blood. Not only was it gorgeous to look at, but its defensive power was also, in every practical sense, something that every knight would want to lay their hands on. After the Blazing Sun Empire had lost its former glory, most of the armor was lost. The few that remained were collected by noblemen as antiques, and they were rarely found as items to be sold. It was now the second morning upon Abel's arrival. Having brushed himself off with the help of a maid, Abel came to the dining room for some breakfast. After seeing that the Knight of Marshall was already waiting for him, he quickly came to apologize. Sorry for making you wait, sir. That's okay. How's your sleep last night? The Knight of Marshall asked casually. Very good. The bed was very comfortable when I slept on it. It's good to hear that. The Knight of Marshall gestured Abel to come. Here, come have a seat. The servants started handing out the dishes after they've said their grace. Surprisingly enough, there were a lot of different things in Abel's plate: eggs, sausages, bacon, and green vegetables. Actually, there shouldn't be green vegetables this season. How did they get them here? Realizing the surprise on Abel's face, the Knight of Marshall explained, it's the work of the Druids. They used their special powers to grow these vegetables. The prices they sold these for are, well, very befitting of their status. Abel's heart started churning after hearing this. What other casters are there apart from the Druids? Seeing how interested Abel was about this topic, the Knight of Marshall put down his knife. You're talking about the wizards, aren't you? Wizards. So maybe that's why Abel couldn't use the scroll of town portal. Maybe magic scrolls were limited for the wizards. If Abel wanted to go home, he must find a chance to learn about the wizards. Once breakfast was over, the Knight of Marshall told Abel to come to his study. He poured a cup of coffee for Abel, and only spoke once Abel sipped it. Abel, you are already a member of the Harry family. The Knight of Marshall paused for a bit to find the right words. I think I should be honest with you. The power you released yesterday belongs to a rank 4 novice knight. Abel raised his head in shock. He didn't expect to be exposed to this quickly. In his defense, he only used his real power for only a few seconds. It's okay. It's okay, the Knight of Marshall held onto Abel's shoulder. I know that you were watching out for your older brother. You didn't want to make him feel bad about himself, right? As far as that guess was from the actual truth, Abel didn't bother to give his explanation. If anything, that was a more reasonable explanation than talking about the Horadric Cube and all that other nonsense. I'm going to be straight with you. I don't know how you're doing it, but it's not a good idea to suppress your powers. Knights are supposed to be fiery and explosive. Once you decide to hold it back, you start to lose your primitive drive. Do you know what I'm saying? From what the Knight of Marshall was saying, power seemed to be defined differently in this world. Back on planet Earth, one would be considered powerful if he could control his strength, but here, only untamable powers were considered the strongest. What Abel learned on Earth was about relaxation, conserving one's life forces. It was about surviving and living as long and healthy as possible. Since guns weren't invented yet in this world, nobody was looking to live as long as possible. The only thing they were thinking about was to outlive their enemies, which meant being better at killing than anyone else. How should I control my powers, then? Abel asked. I was in the same shoes as you many years ago. Luckily, I've found a solution already. The Knight of Martial placed a long sword on the table. Look at this blade right here. As you know, swords are the most important weapons for a knight. How much do you know about this blade right here? Abel replied after handling the sword for a bit. This sword is 1 meter and 5. Its weight is around 20 pounds. The Knight of Martial swung the sword for a bit. This long sword is designed for a knight. It has been forged for 100 times before it is in the shape that it's in now. The length of this piece is precisely 1.58 meters, and its weight is 21.2 pounds. Do you know why I know so much about it? Because it's yours, Abel said softly, to which the Knight of Martial could hear very clearly. Seeing how unconvinced Abel was getting, he couldn't help but let out a soft chuckle. The Knight of Martial grinned. How about that light sword you have on you? Do you know how long and heavy it is? For a moment, Abel didn't know what to say. He just rubbed his nose for a bit. Estimate by sight. If you work for an armor smith for about a year, you can do just as well as I can. You will have a better grip on your weapon than most trainers. At the same time, you will be able to release all that power and frenzy within you, meanwhile still maintaining the same amount of control that you would normally. Alright, you've convinced me. So where should I learn to make swords? The Knight of Martial raised his cheek. You ever wondered how I got so rich? From what Abel could see, the Hairy Knight's domain was no bigger than the Bennett Knight's domain. Frankly enough, though, the standard of living between the two was miles apart from each other. That being said, Abel wanted to ask about it since day one. You see, there is an iron mine on my property, the Knight of Martial said proudly. I happened to found it right after I was given this piece of land. If it wasn't for that, I would have never built this castle the way Emma wanted me to. The Knight of Martial seemed rather sad when he talked about his wife. When Emma was still with me, she drew the construction plan of this castle, but our savings alone were not enough for the job. We had a lot of faith, though, so we started building it anyways. And just when we were short on money, we happened to found that mine and thank the heaven, we managed to fulfill our dreams together. Chapter 14, Master Bentham. The blacksmith was not located inside the castle. It was right next to the iron mine, which took Abel and the Knight of Martial 20 minutes to arrive by chariots. Even from over a distance, Abel could hear the sound of iron ore being smashed by iron hammers. There was a pile of stone houses, all of which were made by some neatly chiseled boulders. There were chimneys on top of each of them. Right now, 4 out of 6 had dark smoke puffing out. Just by looking at these stone houses, Abel could tell that the Knight of Martial paid a lot of attention to his blacksmith business. The boulders they used were the same as the ones they used for castles. Forget about their actual cost, it would have already cost so much just to carry them all the way from the mountains. The Knight of Martial instructed Abel carefully, we're going to pay a visit to Master Bentham today. Remember to be respectful when you see him. I've invited him over because he's the best man I could find in Harvest City. If he wasn't trying to let his son take over his shop business, we wouldn't have a chance to see him today. Pleased to see you here, Marshal. Master Bentham greeted the Knight of Martial with a simple nod. He was a very big man, standing at 2 meters tall. He had a very solid build. Even at 50-something of age, the big beard on his face gave a no-nonsense aura around the man. Hey there, the Knight of Martial smiled without getting too much into formality. I've brought a young man to you today. Apparently, he's interested in becoming your disciple. Master Bentham looked quite perplexed when he laid his eyes on Abel. Are you talking about this child, Marshal? Please, I know the difference between a young man and a child. This boy is not even 14 yet, and you want him to be one of my disciples. Suddenly, a lot of people started coming over to see what was going on. Master Bentham, this is Abel, my new adopted son. He is currently a novice knight, and he wants you to teach him how to control his powers. Nice thinking. Sorry though, I'm not taking him in, Master Bentham said grimly, my training is not something a young nobleman can bear. Besides, I don't think a boy as young as he has the stamina to swing a hammer. Abel reached out his arm and flexed for a bit. Don't you worry about that, Master Bentham. I can work very hard if I want to, and you aren't the only muscular one here. Ha! Abel was about 1.6 meters. He did have some muscles, yes, but that was nothing compared to Mazer Bentham, who stood at a bear-like height 2 meters. The stark contrast alone was enough to make everybody around laugh. 2 more years, Abel. Once you are a bit taller and stronger, I promise that I will teach you how to forge, Master Bentham said patiently out of respect for the Knight of Martial. How strong do I need to be to train under you? Abel pressed on stubbornly. Master Bentham turned back towards the backyard. Come with me, he said, to which Abel did with the company of the Knight of Martial. The other bystanders, too, came in to see if Abel was ready for the challenge ahead. How many do you think he can lift? I'd be impressed with 1. Nah, 2. He's a novice knight. I'll go with 2. I bet 1. I bet 2. As rowdy as the crowd was getting, both the Knight of Martial and Abel paid no attention to it. When they arrived at the backyard, they saw a bunch of iron pieces being lined up on the ground. There was an iron bar in the middle, and varying sizes of iron pieces on each side going from small to large. They were essentially barbells. It was not very refined compared to the ones that Abel was familiar with, but the design was nevertheless the same. As it turned out, the cultural background had nothing to do with understanding how the human body functioned. I use these locks to train my disciples' strength. You see, they come in different sizes. The smallest ones are 50 pounds, the biggest ones 500. Whenever you go one size bigger, you increase the load by 50 pounds. Get over here, Geddon, Master Bentham pointed towards a man in the crowd. While he was pretty strong himself, this particular fellow was not much different in terms of stature. Master. Geddon explained anxiously as sweat streamed down his dark face, I wasn't being lazy. I was throwing out the metal waste. Everybody started laughing. Geddon was a familiar face here at the blacksmith shop. He was recruited after Master Bentham came to the Hairy Castle. Whilst originally an apprentice, he quickly became a disciple because of how hard-working he was. There were a lot of differences between an apprentice and a disciple. Apprentices had it much worse because most of their work was centered around intense physical labor. Usually, it involved cutting and burning timber for the entire day. Even worse, there was no pay. Disciples, on the other hand, had the privilege to learn from their master directly. At the end of the month, they would also receive a wage that was equivalent to the quality of their work. Geddon was a very likable student to Master Bentham. He was honest, hard-working and willing to learn. Once Master Bentham retired, he would be the go-to person to continue serving the Knight of Martial. No, Geddon, I'm telling you to come here so you can show Abel how to use the locks. Go ahead and teach him what it takes to be my disciple. Yes sir, Geddon smiled modestly as he rubbed his hands together. He then walked to the third lock and turned his head towards Abel. Watch me closely, Abel. With his hands grasping both ends of the iron bar, Geddon let out a big shout and raised the 150-pound thing from the ground. Because of how easily it went over his head, it almost felt like he was picking up a straw or something. Nice one, lad. With everyone cheering out for him, Geddon dropped the iron lock onto the ground. As Geddon turned to his master for some feedbacks, Master Bentham nodded his head in approval. Keep going, Geddon. Yes sir. Geddon proceeded to the fourth lock, which was roughly 200 pounds in total weight. It wasn't that hard for him to lift it, though. He readied himself, grabbed onto the thing and picked it up. No drama. It wasn't so easy when he tried out the fifth one. Still, he managed to raise it over his head after a bit of hesitation. Things got tense when he walked over to the sixth lock. It was a 300-pound lock. Most people couldn't even hold one end for more than 3 seconds, let alone pick it up from the ground. Geddon didn't start right away this time. For a few seconds there, he closed his eyes and adjusted his breathing for a bit. Once he was ready, he let out a roar and veins started bursting out of his neck. His face was red like a tomato, except it looked like it was about to explode from the inside. Nevertheless, the lock went over his head. Everybody was yelling in celebration for him. Very well, Geddon, Master Bentham gave a proud look. Even with the strength you have now, you are still making progress every single day. It wouldn't be long before you can surpass even my limits. Really? Geddon scratched his head as he shied away from the compliment. Ah, you're being too kind, sir. There is still a lot I need to do before I can get to where you're at. Your turn now, Abel. Master Bentham turned his head towards the boy who dared to challenge him. Contrary to what he had expected, Abel didn't back down after laying his eyes on Geddon's performance. Abel was already walking towards the third lock. To be clear, Abel did approve Geddon of his strength. That being said, there were absolutely no skills in the way he lifted those weights. For the millionth time, Abel was a former bodybuilding trainer. The barbell was one of his favorite pieces of equipment back on Earth. It was his job to be good at using it. If Geddon's maximum was around 300 pounds, he could probably lift to 350 pounds if he knew the right techniques. There were a lot of things that were wrong about his form. If he wasn't so strong already, he would be severely injured right now. Even if he wasn't injured, there was bound to be a lot of damage in the long term. He's going for the 150. Good grace. He's not going to do it. Is he mad? The crowd started being noisy again when it was Abel's turn. Abel frowned a little because of that. He didn't like being watched like he was some clown in a circus. Out, thank you, Master Bentham shooed the crowd away. He could tell that Abel didn't like being watched. As for the reason for this, well, he just thought that Abel didn't want to be a laughing stock. Realizing that they've angered Master Bentham, the crowd started rushing out of the backyard. Try your best, but don't push yourself too much, Master Bentham said. This marks the end of part 3 of the story, Abe the Wizard. Thank you for listening. Please like the video and hit the subscribe button to listen more. Hit the bell icon to get notified of all the new content uploaded to the channel ASAP.